Namaste. On the valedictory ceremony of Young India Talk series based on the life of Mahatma Gandhi, organized by Yogi, that is Youth Organization for Green India. I, Revatmans Govindwa, warmly welcome you all. Today, we all have an unprecedented opportunity to hear the first-hand experience of one of the India's most talented nuclear physicists. He was the director of Bhabha Atomic Research Center. He has also been awarded by the prestigious Padma Vibhushan by the Government of India on 26 January 2009 for his invaluable contribution in the field of nuclear science. On the one hand, it seems that there aren't enough words to portray his complete introduction. But at the same time, I feel from the depth of my heart that his work and his life itself is his true introduction. His words will convince you about his dedication towards his work and the social commitment behind the work. I am also eager to get the energy of his inspiring words. So now, without taking any more of your time, I now hand over the mic to Dr. Anil G. Kakolkar. Anil Ji.
Namaskar. I would like to thank Yogi, the youth organization for Green India, for this invitation to me to be a part of Young India Talk Series 2021. I would like to compliment all members in this movement to bring to the youth of India uh, a very important aspect of India's development, which was actually conceptualized by Mahatma Gandhi ji. And somewhere along the line, we have lost track of it. And as I will describe later, it's actually costing us fair bit. And how it is important for us to revisit what Gandhiji had told us and how it is important in today's context, or for that matter, the 21st century context. So that is what I'm going to talk about, and I hope uh, the audience listening to this lecture would like it, and more importantly, would do something about it as they think fit. So, talking about 21st century and Gandhiji, I think we must do some stock taking of what has happened during last 75 years in our country. Uh, then we will talk about what are the current issues, and then we'll go back to the period of Gandhiji and how he had kind of foreseen many things, and how he had put an action plan, a philosophy, and a way of life in place, which was so relevant. And I'll connect that with today's time and explain how it is important in today's context, and what is it that we should be doing uh, during today. So it's clear that post independence, India has adopted to be a democracy, and we have emerged as the uh, largest democracy in the world. And in terms of the size of the country, population, again, while we are only next to China, but looks like we'll soon overtake them, and so we would become the largest population in the world. In terms of economics, we have we are actually third largest economy in dollar purchase parity terms. But even in real dollar terms, we are about sixth largest economy. So we have made a lot of progress. However, if you look at economy in per capita terms, then you would find, because earning or GDP per capita is defines the resources available to people and in some manner quality of life. And so in that term, per capita income, per capita GDP, we are very, very low, and we have miles to go. And in fact, that is what we should be aiming at. Now, of course, while doing, we have to be concerned about sustainability on Earth and also sustainability of our own society. And so to that extent, we should moderate that ambition, which is the central pillar of the Gandhian philosophy. You have to live within our means. We'll come back to this later. India's progress, I think we have made a lot of progress in terms of infrastructure, in terms of agri. Uh, if I had to describe, we are one of the largest producer of agriculture and horticulture products, up from a country which were, at times ship to mouth condition was there in terms of hunger and food supply. In terms of our electricity system, again, total size of electricity system, production of coal, steel, road network, railway network, IT infrastructure, communication industry, entertainment industry. All these things, if you look at in global terms, we would be somewhere at the top. In a few places, right at the top of the world, in a few places, certainly well within first five. But at the same time, we have a lot of problems in our country. And so there is a huge issue of migration. There is migration from rural India to urban India, but also there is migration from India to foreign countries. And that is because everybody moves in search of opportunities. And wherever people find opportunities, they seem to migrate, which is, mind you, is not a very healthy thing to happen in an ultimate sense. But that's a fact of life. And even in that context, uh, the Indian diaspora outside the country, it contributes significantly to India's economy, just as other economic activities like agriculture, manufacturing, service sector contribute to India's economy. You would be surprised that uh, India continues to be the largest country of origin of international migrants, with around 17.5 million strong diaspora across the world. And this contributes to around 3.4% of India's GDP by way of their remittances. This amounts to nearly double contribution to India's economy in per capita terms, which is significant. You would also notice that even migration within the country from rural areas to urban areas contributes a lot to, we used to talk about money order economy. The young people go to cities to earn a living, and families back in villages, which is a very commonplace thing, which is a good thing. But I think that raises this question, like India, which is even today, Gandhiji's time, it was certainly all rural dominated. But even today, as per the census rather, latest census, uh, India is about two-thirds rural population and this may be changing. The latest numbers are not available, but it would be safe to say that still the larger part of India's population lives in villages. And in spite of the fact that migration is taking place on a very large scale, Indian population, majority of it would be living in villages. And so if Indian economy has to grow, India's quality of life of our people has to grow, then I think we cannot ignore villages. We have to focus on villages where the per capita income today is just around half of per capita income in cities. And that is the problem statement that we should all address. We are all young people, not me, but I'm addressing you. And if you are talking about uh, reconstructing India, you must focus on villages. And I'll come back to this again. But let us also discuss some of the challenges that we have, in spite of the fact that we have made impressive progress. One of the big challenge is the disparity in the country has actually grown. Disparity has been always there. Bapuji also has talked about it at length in many places. But that disparity is actually rising in our country today, and this is actually the problem of world over. So what is happening in India is not unique; it is happening everywhere in the world. And for example, the while the income share of top 1% of India's population, that share is rising. It's not decreasing. We're talking about democracy, we're talking about social harmony, social equity. But the income share of top 1% of the population has been continuously rising. And in the most recent year for which the estimates are available, 1% population has 22% income share in the country. And I'm not talking about wealth. Wealth is much, much higher. And about half of this income, half of this 22% of the total income of the country, that is half of 22%, which is the total uh, in 1%, half of that is in within top 0.1%. One tenth of the top layer of 1% holds half, 1% people are holding, and remaining 99% people are holding the rest. And there are examples in the world where the disparity is even higher, but that is not our lookout at this moment. We are looking at India. So this has led to disproportionate amassing of wealth in the top layer with very. And there is a theory, Dr. Muhammad Yunus, Nobel laureate from Bangladesh, he has been propounding this, that if you have major income generation at the bottom layer, base of the pyramid, socio-economic pyramid, then the trickle down or trickle up is much better and it diffuses into the economy better. But if you have earnings at the top, that also trickles, not that it does not trickle, but that trickle down is very, very slow. And so I think it is important that we focus on enhancing the income of the people at the base of pyramid. And particularly since we know that in India there is a large divide between urban areas and rural areas. So we must really focus on rural domain. Many of you might have heard about this term Gini index. Gini index is a of the disparity in the society. If you look in villages, rural area, India, if you look at Gini index in urban India, now you would find that while the income is of course much higher in urban areas, but and we may feel that the disparity in villages may be low. Not true. The disparity in villages is actually more. Only thing is the maximum earning in villages is probably lower than maximum earning in cities. But the disparities so the point is there is a urban rural divide with disparity growing between the two. But within urban areas, the disparity is growing. Within the rural areas, disparity is growing. And comparatively, if you compare the Gini index in rural areas and urban areas, you would find Gini index or the disparity in rural areas is actually higher. So there is something wrong in the way our social setup uh, has been built. And this is at the heart of the problem that we must solve. So this is one fundamental point that I wanted to establish. Now, I want to come back to the experience during pandemic. The question is, you may ask, okay, fine, but ultimately people migrate to cities, earn money, they are sending money. So it's good for villages because, otherwise, where are the opportunities in villages? There is no earning, there are no opportunities. And how to create those opportunities in villages is something I'll come. But just to understand how this present way of setup leads to extreme situation, uh, I think the recent pandemic has shown us that in a very stark. The you know I'm talking about the first lockdown when the lockdown was announced, and there are a large number of so-called daily wage workers, and they're all there in many industries, many construction projects, and suddenly this large number of construction workers found continuing in cities became a huge challenge for them. And many of them were there with their families, children, and overnight they found that their jobs are gone. Not only the jobs are gone, but then the where they were staying, they had no money to pay. For example, the rent for the house or accommodation they were having. They had no money to carry on their life in cities. And so there was this huge distress migration that all of us have seen. Now, this was so stressful, or this was under such a high distress that many could not really wait for the bookings to be available in train or in buses. And there were challenges because of the pandemic had already set in. And so they all resorted to walking. Many of them, their hometowns were several hundred kilometers away, some even 1,000 kilometers or more further away. But they all resorted to even walking, and not walking just alone because many of them had their families. So walking with their families, children. So you can imagine the distress this has caused. And the question that we should ask is why it has been so. You know, we move to some place in search of opportunities, but while it we earn money more than what probably we could have earned in villages, but in the process, the quality of life of these people had become extremely low. You know, you don't enjoy the social life that you enjoy in villages when you live in slums in a city. Every time there is a feeling of insecurity on your head. There will be a lot of these unsocial elements will keep on creating troubles for you, and we tolerate all that because of the helplessness. Now the question is, why do we have to get into a social structure of that kind? Why, if I have come to city from my village, why can't I live a respectful life, a life with reasonable social security in the city or place of my work? Now, which means that the way we are organized or when we have organized things are actually not sustainable. Compare that with we're talking about extreme climate event these days. You know, we are all concerned with climate change and the extreme climate events. Their frequency is increasing, their intensity is increasing, and it's creating a lot of distress to people. Stress is getting created. It's not as if distress never used to happen. Natural phenomena have been happening from time immemorial. But added because of the human activity, unsustainable human activity, we are now creating instability in Earth's climate. And so you have many more such distress phenomena of a much higher intensity and creating same extreme situation. So to me, the extreme situation caused by a pandemic, extreme situation that gets caused because of severe floods or a major cyclone, they have the same root cause. And there is something wrong in terms of the way we have organized our social structures. There is not enough resilience in that social structure. There is, you know, we have not really cared about a stable environment in all its dimensions. And, or as I'll explain later, we are not worried, we're not focused, or we're not given enough attention to what Gandhiji had said. So, this is the statement of the problem and the consequences if we don't attend to that problem. And I don't need to go to an astrologer to say that if we don't correct things in in a reasonable time, things will only move from bad to worse. So let me now talk about another dimension of the human society. Now, we are all evolved. The human species have evolved over a period of time. Now, strictly speaking, seeing in the most broadest term, we are actually a part of the animal kingdom that exists in nature. The difference is we are probably among the most intelligent of all animal species that exist. And as a part of that thinking process, of course, intelligence is there even in other animals because that is how they survive, that is how they search for food, that is how, they search for shelter and things like that. So basic survival instincts are there in all living beings, and particularly so among the animal species. But human intelligence is evolved to a much higher level, and so we have evolved into what we call human society. You don't hear that term animal society, but we have a human society. We have created some sense for ourselves as to how a good society is. We have created, we know, all of us know what is the difference between a human behavior and an animal behavior. Although, let's admit, we are a part of that animal kingdom. So, over a period of time, we have evolved as humans. But the question is, have we eliminated the animal in us? And that part of the answer to that question, at least I would say, I'm not sure. To a different degree, in all of us, there is that animal instinct still prevailing. But I think, on the whole, in evolving that human instinct or the human values, if I can use that term now, we have evolved some values, and we have nurtured those values. That is how human society has come to this stage. And in nurturing those values, the question is, have we really eliminated the animal in us? You know, at times the animal instinct is necessary. For example, if you are going in a sports Olympics, let's say Olympic, you go there for winning a medal. So there is a healthy competition, but that does not mean that if there is a competitor who is likely to win over me, I'll eliminate him. So we don't have we don't like that animal instinct of violence. But we certainly stand healthy competition. In our schools, we study, all of us study. Teachers are supposed to teach all children equally. But you do conduct an exam, and there is somebody who stands first. So, so what I'm saying is, we have to evolve ourselves as human beings with real human values, which we have nurtured. People like Gandhiji, Mahatmas, Gautam Buddha, and many have helped us to understand these human values, have taught us how we should organize ourselves in the society, and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, out of the same intelligence, we have evolved because we have mastered technologies. Animals have not been able to master technology. Human beings have mastered technology. How to plow, we learned how to cook food, we learned how to create a transport vehicle, and so on and so forth. And this is how we evolved ourselves, because out of our intelligence, we developed technology. Now, with technology, our capability, whatever we, in absence of technology, with just our human physical power or energy, with the help of technology, we are able to do much more. We can move faster, our production can be very high. In terms of computing, of course, computer cannot probably be superior to our brain, But there are things which are serial in nature. There are things where, huge computation work, which probably computers can do faster. And that gives us capability. Technology gives us human capability. Now, the question is, come back to this. If it gives us capability, animal instinct is I want to dominate. Now I have got technology under my controls. So again, that animal instinct takes upper hand. I want to dominate. And so if I am able to leverage technology better than somebody else, then I want to dominate over that somebody else and derive full advantage. So just as the physical power in a jungle makes some strong species dominate over others, or shall we say they exploit others, including for their food, because they mastered technologies, they started dominating others. So the technology, I get a power to exploit. And this is precisely what Gandhiji was against. People think Gandhiji was against technology. In my view, Gandhiji was not against technology. Gandhiji was against exploitation that happens because of technology. And that is a subtle difference that we all must understand. Because if technology starts exploiting, then we get this disparity, or also we get that problem which we just described. Where there are major projects happening in urban areas which require people. Uh, at the same time, there are major factories in urban areas which produce many things which, what 1 million people will produce, maybe 100 people produce. So what happens to the livelihood of those 1 million people? So on one side, we have this exploitation by way of migration, people coming to cities. On the other hand, whatever little livelihood was left for people in villages, now I have this massive production capability because of technology. And I can go to a village and say, oh, you are taking so much, it takes so much of money. I will give you this at maybe half the cost or one-fourth of the cost. Maybe they might have produced it in 1/10 of the cost. So weak people feel, oh, I'm getting something cheaper, so let me buy this. But the larger advantage is derived by the rich and the powerful because they get larger benefit. Now the question is, and this is how the disparity grows. There is another element to this growth in disparity. Value chain. Everybody, we all do work and we do value addition in whatever we do. In villages, a carpenter does value addition. The farmer, whatever the farmer produces in the field itself is a value addition because he has produced food. But some also resort to little processing of that food. That's also a value addition. And as you do value addition, you are supposed to get compensation for the addition that you have carried out. And finally, this value added product reaches the buyer or the consumer. Now, in the process, all this requires capital. Farmer requires capital when it comes to buying seeds, fertilizer, other inputs. A small factory owner requires capital because he has got a big order, but he must have some working capital to get all the inputs to, deliver on that order. So he borrows that money. And so in this value addition, then there is that economic activity of providing capital, and that has to be returned with due interest. I would ask you to do a little exercise that when you do value addition on the on whatever activities you do and wherever, but I'm talking in the context of rural domain. When you do value addition there, what is the level of compensation that you get in terms of, let's say, number of hours you have worked at different levels of capability, but and that leads to price increase. Also look at it because somebody has given money, somebody has given capital, and I have to pay interest. That also increases the price because finally that interest also has to be recovered. So you find out in the price structure how much is the increase because of actual value addition and how much is the increase because of this financial management. And you would find that the increase in prices is disproportionately high, which are actually not productive. This is where we call dalali, because of dalali, these things go up disproportionately. And so we need a system where there is a, a reasonable, proportionate, uh, equitable method of pricing. Let me take this one step further. For example, when you're creating, let's talk about agriculture. Agriculture, you require different services, right? A few things like seeds and fertilizer and agricultural implements and all that you buy. But water, so now of course we have irrigation systems, but primarily water is given to us by nature. Even more importantly, agricultural cannot flourish because of the in absence of pollination services that nature provides. There are insects, butterflies, and they provide a great service in terms of pollination. And that is how agriculture. Now you tell me that if you spoil the environment and the insects are all gone or dislocated or something, and the pollination services get disrupted, what will happen to agriculture? Now the question is, who pays for that? We merely say air is good quality, air is available, everybody's property. We don't worry about polluting a bit. We say there is a river flowing, it is God's gift, so I have a right to pollute. The question is, in so doing, you are disturbing nature's services. And we all know if I get a financial service from somebody or if I get a storage service from somebody, I have to pay. Who will pay for this? And so in our culture, there was this great feeling about protection of nature, almost with the religious feeling, we used to all do that. Now, I'm not talking, but the fact is, as the human society evolved, as the human values evolved, there was this feeling about nature. But then, in that animal instinct of human beings, we have just forgotten about that. So, animal instinct is I do what I like to do, which is profitable to me. If I had done some sin, I'll go to the temple in the evening and pray to God. My sin is washed away because I'm religious. Now that is the distortion. And next day morning, I'm ready to continue with committing sins again. At some stage, maybe there is some Sadhu Mahatma has come. He is giving a great pravachan. I spend half an hour, 1 hour listening to that pravachan, feel very impressed as to how enlightened that pravachan has been. Come with lot of joy in mind. By the time I sleep over it, next day morning, I'm back to the old person and continue with my activity. Look at Gandhiji. Gandhiji also used to do bhajan in ashrams, and that used to be a collective thing. Everybody used to collect and do. After bhajan, there used to be some discussion, some pravachan. Everybody used to discuss different important things, and it used to impact their life. It is not as if they sleep over and next day they are back to square one. It is not though. Every day these people have thought over, every day they have made some improvement. So Gandhiji, there are people who think Gandhiji earned us freedom. Yes, he did. But that's the political part of Gandhiji. But Gandhiji did even more work in terms of thinking and actually demonstrating how the society should be. He actually lived, created an example of that. He talked about Grama Swaraj and he lived in villages. He talked about self reliance, and for him in the ashram, everybody was equal. It is, early morning you would go, everybody will spend some half an hour, 45 minutes in cleaning the place. Not just your house, but also your. It used to be almost a community activity. Everybody used to talk about, how to conduct our life in a village where we are within the means of what we are able to earn. And he talked about how to improve earning. He invented charkha. Come to think of it, charkha was a machine from a single spindle to amber charkha with multiple spindle is an evolution in technology. It happened during his time, some of it happened after his time. But recognize that, the handloom is a technology. After all, Dhake ki Malmal, which is, India was so much ahead in technology compared to us. But the fact is, it was a technology. But the important thing is that technology was not exploitative. That technology created reasonably uniform livelihood opportunities for everybody. And of course, there was always this feeling that while villages should be Atmanirbhar, we should, you have to always get something from somewhere, you cannot be living in isolation. But all villages should be net exporter. He didn't say that you create an iron curtain around you, but make sure that you don't become dependent or vulnerably dependent on others. So if you have to buy something from outside, you must be able to export something else of a larger value. And strictly speaking, if human intelligence that human beings possess, if they are able to create more value, then everybody should be able to export. Because ultimately, if there is no addition to value addition capability, then you would say if somebody is exporting, somebody has to import. But if there is an overall upliftment because of technology and technology used in a manner which is non-exploitative, then I think all villages can be net exporter. All villages are net exporters, then obviously uh, everybody should increase their income, and so disparity should not arise. And if we now reach education, when we start talking about education, people in villages, they can hardly get access to school education. Maybe a bigger village or town, they may get access to the high school education. Some bigger towns, maybe they will get access to college education. But the fact still remains that you have to move from lower level of, for example, the villages to towns and cities to get access to education. Not bad, that is good. But in the process, the education loses the so-called situated learning. A very important part of the education is to learn from surroundings, both in terms of the practices that go on, because there is a lot of learning there, but also in terms of identifying the problem that exists and how, while I'm learning, how I can solve those problems and how, what are the elements of learning that I should focus on so that I will be able to solve that problem. And if that is a process right from school days, there is always something which I can learn during my primary school and also implement that as a problem solving. There is always something similarly I can learn while I am in the, or for that matter, college. So that situated learning is an extremely important element. Here, what happens is when we move away, we of course learn some knowledge, but we become aliens in our own place. There are some people, family bonds, because of extremely important and strong values within the family, they remain rooted. So they would want to come back. Who go abroad, acquire higher education, but they come back because they have those values. But some people also become aliens. They suddenly think that, oh, how wonderful, I'm able to earn this, all this, but this is not existing in my village. So why do I go back to my village? I'll go to meet my people once in a year or once in 3, 4 years, and that's enough. Why not I enjoy a good quality life elsewhere? That creates disparity. Now, it is one thing that you be on the other side of disparity, but mind you, there are others who are much above you and they create disparity which is you. So you are never happy. You are happy that you have come out of your villages and you are enjoying a better quality of life which you could not have thought about. But you are also unhappy because there is someone as intelligent as you, but because of other factors, that fellow is going much faster than you. And it is that feeling of disparity when you're on the disparity that makes you very unhappy. And so if we say if you look at happiness quotient, Bhutan is the country which is most happy. And probably if you go to the most rich countries in the world, you will find people there are most unhappy. It is because of these factors. So I think we need to understand this. It is not as if we should live in poverty. But the question is, why not I create wealth where I belong to and at the same time raise quality of life of everybody me while I raise my quality of life. And if you do that, and of course, if I remain conscious about the environment, because there is also this disparity element in terms of sustainability, which of course again we have to. So I think you must have recognized by now that look our how rich our culture has been, how conscious about protection of nature it has been, how deep our teachings are, but we seem to be drifting away from that in this rat race driven in the modern society. And I think we need to change. Now I come to the last part of my lecture. All this happens, uh, you may say, well, this is the natural thing to happen. Probably, yes. All this happened because, in long time back, there was an agrarian era. An agrarian era, obviously, the major source of income was out of agriculture. And you must recognize that at that time, India's GDP was about highest in the world. But then came the industrial era because of technology. Industrialization began. It primarily began in Western Europe, and as industrialization started taking place, I talked to you about it earlier. Uh, Somehow that became the major mode of wealth generation, and we lagged behind in that era. And this was the time when Gandhiji was actually active. So he sensed that danger that India is an agrarian society, and now there is industrialization taking place in England, where that industrialization is primarily around textile and a few other domain, mobile, automobiles, and things like that. And that, so if we have created a domestic model of equitable earning by way of hand spinning, hand weaving, so that they all earn their livelihood. Now that you have this massive trees, earlier they were there in England, sooner they came back to big cities in India, Bombay, Ahmedabad, Calcutta, wherever. Obviously, they were a threat to the people in villages. And so Gandhiji has to rightly oppose that because he was very sure that the rate at which that has happened is so exploitative that there will be irreparable damage to villages, which is what has happened. Now, to this detailed dynamics. So, but I said this to understand why, in my view, Bapuji was so much against technology. He was not against technology, I repeat, he was against the exploitative nature of technology. And if there is a large gap between technological capabilities of human beings, then that exploitative element does set in. Now, let us go fast forward. Today, we are in knowledge era. You know, today, for example, you see earlier, as I said, agriculture was the largest contributor to economy. Then manufacturing was the largest contributor to economy. In some measure, even today it is. But I think in knowledge era, it is the knowledge economy which will dominate. And a small measure of that is what we see in service sector. The service sector is dominating because you require service sector inputs for everything. You require that for agriculture, you require that for manufacturing, and you also require that for day-to-day activities. Now, today service sector essentially means leveraging IT, information technology. But that IT is slowly, that is, of course, it is a major thing today. But now there is going knowledge technologies like artificial intelligence, like machine learning, like robotics. And also there are many new areas. Communication is changing very fast. Soon quantum technologies may come in all areas, including communication. Now, these are things which are very, very disruptive. And so the question is, one way would be to take the same attitude that, look, this is going to be exploitative. It is becoming exploitative. You are hearing Pegasus, what has happened? It's a manifestation of that exploitation potential in a different domain. Now the question is, one is that, look, we have nothing to do. We will not allow this. Now, the knowledge era with this fast communication, there are many things which the governments cannot even control. So I don't know how much we'll be able to control on the basis of our own inner values. That could be one way consistent with Gandhian principles. So I think the key to me is that we must race ahead in the knowledge era and be competitive and not allow differential between us and others to allow them to become exploitative. We must be very strong in that area. Now, if you want to set up a big factory, you require a lot of capital. And of course, you want to set up large facilities in knowledge here, whether in the area of, for example, semiconductors or in other areas. You do require large factories involving large outlay. But there is a much larger segment of that, which is actually human activity, artificial intelligence, for example, which seems to be dominating. That actually requires well-trained, intelligent human experts. Even manufacturing, now 3D manufacturing has come, 3D printing has come. So manufacturing can be made decentralized. It's not necessary that everything has to happen in a big factory. I can have a, a small 3D printing machine set up in a small room next to my cow shed in the village. And through internet access the data required, carry out the manufacture and supply the components. So in knowledge era, we must recognize that knowledge technologies, they promote decentralization and even more importantly, they promote democratization. So the challenge which was posed by era can be easily averted if we do capacity building of our young people in villages and in fact leverage the potential of knowledge era. So my point is, if agriculture was the prime source of earning in villages and in urban areas working in a factory is a prime source of earning so far, but today we know what dominates is service sector. And that service sector, essentially, it is, in fact, Indian youth has it's a big forte for them. They are the people who contribute to the service sector products both in India and abroad. Now imagine this larger number of youth is in villages. If you have brought education, the right education in villages, and if the village youth is also to service sector, which is around 50% of India's economy, then it will contribute to a very rapid rise in village economy. And it doesn't require a lot of capital. It is just that education and capacity building. And with the help of that capability, we can strengthen our agriculture, we can strengthen our manufacturing in village areas. And of course, we can strengthen service sector and also leverage the new opportunities in knowledge area. You must have heard Zoho Corporation is a major multinational company. It's a global company. It had its headquarters in United States. He decided that why can't he operate from his village in Tamil Nadu? So he shifted his global headquarters from his headquarters place in US to his village in Tamil Nadu. Rest of it is all there. It's still a global corporation. It's still, but then in Tamil Nadu, at his hometown, where his headquarters is now located, he has created a university. And he trains local youth. And they are contributing to global products. Imagine what is going to happen to village economy there. And in some, for example, you can take example of Amul, not knowledge economy, but technology. Amul is a global brand, and at some stage when it started, movement is located, had per capita income higher than any other place in India. It has changed now, but it is still quite high. So Amul, exception to what I said earlier, the village income is half of urban income. Village income can become multiples of urban income, provided we organize ourselves well. And Gandhiji gave emphasis on Bunyadi Shiksha. He gave emphasis on Nahi Talim. He gave emphasis on the so-called situated education. So my simple point is, why can't we focus on villages and create our villages, particularly the village youth, as competent as the urban youth? And if you do that, then I think the income, village income, will in fact, there is no reason, because villages can contribute to agriculture, industry, and service sector inputs, all the three in the knowledge economy. Unfortunately, cities can contribute only to industry and service sector economy. They can also contribute to agriculture in a bit way through vertical agriculture and whatnot, but not so much because the major agricultural land is in villages. So my premise is, in the fundamental way, if you look at it, in knowledge economy, there are much larger opportunities in villages than in cities. If only we prepare our youth consistent with Gandhian philosophy, we grow, we become net exporters, but not become exploitative. You know, be aware of nature, make sure that, our traditional Indian values, which have a great meaning, and we don't saying it in a temple, giving a public lecture, but to imbibe that in our own practice. If you do that, I think there is no stopping. And that is the message Gandhian teaching holds for us in 21st century. And according to me, this is entirely consistent with Gandhian philosophy. So I urge all of you to think about these issues. And, I have already done some work on a concept which I call sillage. Sillage is actually taking it one step forward beyond Pura, which Dr. Kalam used to propagate. Pura was providing urban amenities in rural areas. Sillage is bridging the village gaps, or creating a knowledge city and village. And if we do that, I think we will contribute a lot to India's progress, leveraging Gandhian philosophy. Thank you very much.
धन्यवाद अनिल जी। यंग इंडिया टॉक सीरीज योगी के इस वार्षिक व्याख्यानमाला के उपक्रम में पिछले 10 दिन से आप अलग अलग महानुभवों को सुन रहे हैं। आज ये समारोह का दिन, लेकिन ये समारोह नहीं तो नए विचारों की, नए प्रेरणाओं की एक शुरुआत है। क्योंकि पिछले 10 दिनों में अलग अलग लोगों को गांधी जी की सार्वकालिकता पर जब हम सब सुन रहे थे, तो अनेक विध लोगों में एक अलग तरीके की चेतना आई। हमें अलग तरीके के फीडबैक्स भी मिले, जिनसे हमें ये काम निरंतर करने की प्रेरणा भी मिलती है। मैं इस समय आभार व्यक्त करना चाहूंगा सभी वक्ताओं के, जिन्होंने इस कोविड के काल में जो कुछ परिस्थितियां सामने है, उनका बिजी शेड्यूल सामने है, लेकिन फिर भी हम युवाओं के इस संगठन के इस उपक्रम के लिए समय निकाल कर हमें मार्गदर्शित किया और आश्वासित भी किया है कि अगले कार्यों में भी हमारे साथ जुड़े रहेंगे। तो उनका आभार व्यक्त करना ये मेरा कर्तव्य है। इसी के साथ आप हर रोज 5 बजे इस सब को सुन रहे थे, लेकिन इस 5 बजे सुनने से पहले जो कुछ गतिविधियां हो रही थी, इन सब में जिनका हाथ था, उनका उल्लेख मैं करना जरूरी समझूंगा। इस योगी के टेक्निकल टीम का हेड रेवार्थ, जो कभी प्रवास में था फिर भी वो साथ में कंप्यूटर का सीपीयू लेके चल रहा था, क्योंकि योगी के काम में व्यत्यय ना हो। या फिर दूसरी तरफ आप रोज अक्षता को सुन रहे थे, जो शुरुआत और अंत में साथ में सेशन में रहती थी। या उससे भी पीछे जो बैकस्टेज रहकर इस सब काम में थे, उसमें अनुजा हो, सोहम हो, प्रनिल हो या अन्य कुछ गण जो इस सब में जुड़े रहते हैं, उनका उल्लेख मैं करना चाहूंगा। पिछली बार और इस बार भी इनका जो सहयोग था, इनका जो समर्पण था, इसी वजह से मैं मानता हूं कि इतने अच्छी तरीके से हम आप तक पहुंच पाए। और आशा करूंगा कि इन सब के सहयोग से, आप श्रोताओं के सहयोग से और आगे बढ़ सके। और अंत में आपका आभार तो व्यक्त करना जरूरी ही लगता है, क्योंकि ये सब करना ये तो कार्यक्रम का भाग हो जाता है, लेकिन इसमें आप जैसे लोगों का सम्मिलित होना, ये सुनना और 4 लोगों में इसके बारे में बात करना, इसके बारे में चेतना जगाना, ये सब काम आप श्रोताओं ने किया है। तो आपका आभार व्यक्त करना ये तो मैं आज जरूरी बात समझता हूँ। और इसी के साथ में योगी का ये जो यूट्यूब चैनल है, इसको जब से हमने शुरुआत किया, एक में से इस यूट्यूब चैनल की अलग से कार्य हमने शुरू किया जो अवेयरनेस के लिए काम करता है और रूरल इंडिया को वॉइस प्रोवाइड करना, ये हमारा उद्देश्य है। तो इस चैनल के कार्य में भी आप सभी जुड़े रहेंगे, आपके समविचारी लोगों को इस चैनल से जुड़ा कर रखेंगे, जिससे आगे भी जो कुछ गतिविधियां होगी उन सब में आप जुड़ सके, ऐसी ही आशा करता हूँ। फिर एक बार सभी का मनपूर्वक आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ। योगी के इस मालिका में आप सभी ने जो साथ दिया वो बहुत अनमोल था। आगे भी योगी के ग्राउंड के एक्टिविटीज में और इस तरीके के वर्चुअल एक्टिविटीज में भी आप अपना सहयोग देंगे, इस आशा के साथ। नमस्ते, जय जगत।